The first topic we will be looking at regarding science fiction versus science fact comes out of Star Wars. The movie is full of references to science fiction ideas, but there's one specifically I'd like to mention because there's a couple things I have to say about it. And that is light speed travel possible? The answer is no, science fiction all the way around. The reason for this is that because the faster a craft would travel in space, the greater the force of gravity is on it. The greater the force of gravity is on it, the more energy is required to propel it forward. At the speed of light, it would require an infinite amount of energy to propel the craft through space, which simply isn't possible. That's like saying we would need all the energy in the universe to propel a craft, and even if you could somehow harness all of the energy from all of the matter in the universe, you would not be able to travel at the speed of light for very long. So this is science fiction. The other thing I would like to point out here is the way speed of light travel is depicted in the films, where from the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon or, say, a Calamari cruiser, the solitary points of light that the stars are turn into horizontal lines once they hit light speed. This would not happen also, this is science fiction, because the distance between stars is simply too great. Even if you had stars that were relatively close, about 4 or 5 light years away, even if you were traveling at the speed of light, it would still take you 4 or 5 years to get there. Then you take into account the fact that most of the objects in a star field from the cockpit of one of these fictional space cruisers are hundreds, if not thousands, of light years away themselves. So again, traveling at the speed of light, it would take you hundreds of thousands of years to get to these objects. They would remain stationary in your field of view. They would not turn into horizontal pins of light. So we have science fiction on both counts. Sorry, Star Wars. I love you. Moving right along. Item number 2. From a recent movie some of you have heard of called Interstellar. Is artificial gravity possible as depicted in the film? Now, the way they depict artificial gravity in the film is with a spacecraft called the Endurance, which is a circular spacecraft, and what they do is basically rotate it and use centrifugal force to simulate Earth's gravity so that they can walk around on the inside. Is this science fiction or science fact? This one is science fact, but there is a however to it. The way they have depicted it in the film would not necessarily work in real life. The reason for this is to simulate Earth's gravity on a spacecraft with sufficient rotation, you would be subjected to what is known as the Coriolis effect. Now, what would be going on here is that a human standing in this spacecraft as it's rotating with sufficient force to simulate Earth's gravity, let's say it's an average human, an adult male, let's say 6 feet tall. His head and feet would be traveling at different speeds because one would be closer to the center than the other. So if a human standing on the spacecraft, sitting rather, tried to stand on the spacecraft, they would essentially fall over. So while the simulation of gravity is fairly accurate, what would need to be done is a slower rotation to simulate a smaller amount of gravity. Now, what you would be looking for is probably somewhere in between 1g Earth's gravity and the gravity of the moon, about 1/6. That way, it would be enough for, say, liquid to stay in a cup or a pen to stay on a desk, but would not cause such a dramatic effect on a human standing up and walking around. While this would be an efficient solution to the necessity of the human body and gravity, the only problem is that we are not yet aware of the long-term effects of humans being exposed to a low-gravity environment. So until we continue with experiments such as sending astronauts into space for extended periods of time, we simply will not know how dramatic of an effect this will have on human biological systems. The next item we'll be looking at is, can life survive in space? This one, science fact. There have been many organisms that have been studied in space and found to have survived, some on purpose, some on accident. The first of these organisms are called beer microbes, also known as OU20. No, they do not come from beer the liquid. They were taken from the Beer Mountains in England near a remote fishing village. They were placed on the exterior of the International Space Station for 553 days. When inspected after they got back to Earth, many were still alive. They are speculated to have survived because of their extremely thick gel-like walls and the microbes' habit of forming colonies in harsh conditions to protect the cells on the interior. The second one that was found to have survived is called Streptococcus mitis. These were found to have been stowed away on a camera that was stored in the Surveyor probes, which were the first to land on the moon. They survived for over 2 years before returning on Apollo 12. To this day, NASA is a bit ambiguous on the subject, but has recently become more open, and in fact recently celebrated the 30-year anniversary of their return in 1999. Another microbe that has been found to have done well in space is sea plankton. Sea plankton was found on the exterior of the International Space Station by Russian cosmonauts, and basically what happened here is that they stowed away on the ship also, through humidity or water vapor, touching on the spacecraft, got launched into space, and lived. The next one that was found to have done well was lichen. This lichen was exposed to the vacuum of space in 2008. It went into a dormant state until it waited for better conditions, and then once it returned to Earth, it began to grow and thrive again. The next one that was found to have done well is Bacillus pumilus. Researchers on the International Space Station exposed these spores to simulated Mars environment. Some of these spores happened to survive for over 18 months. And finally, last but not least, these adorably creepy-looking little creatures called tardigrades, also known as water bears, which are aquatic microanimals with 8 legs, are the first known animal species to survive in space. In 2007, for 10 days, some were exposed to solar radiation, some the vacuum of space, and some to both. The ones that were ultraviolet shielded, about 68% of them survived, and the ones that were exposed to both conditions, only about 3 specimens lived. Despite all this, the conclusion of the STS-134 crew, which was the last run of the Space Shuttle Endeavour, was that the conditions did not significantly alter their survival chances in flight. That concludes my video for Science Fiction versus Science Fact. Thank you for watching.